Those who won our independence believed that the menace to freedom was an inert people, that public discourse is a political duty, and that the fitting remedy to evil counsels is good ones. Welcome back to Crayon Box Weekly.
Where we color outside the lines and cut through the noise.
I'm Carl.
I'm Avery.
Let's get started.
The right to protest forms part of the broader freedoms of speech, assembly, and petition protected by the First Amendment of the United States Constitution, which states that Congress shall make no law abridging the right of the people peaceably to assemble and to petition the government for redress of grievances. This protection enables individuals and groups to gather publicly, to express dissent, and to seek governmental change. Today's vibrant protest culture did not emerge fully formed. However, it was developed gradually from English legal traditions and colonial assertions of liberty to the adoption of the Bill of Rights, early Supreme Court decisions, the Civil Rights Movement, and more recent rulings that balance free expression with public order.
No truer words have been said. What I will say and what I want to start out with is that our rights and our First Amendment rights, they go back further than just the Constitution. They go back beyond the Magna Carta to teachings from John Locke and individuals like Montesquieu, who talked to the liberty of speech being something that is indefeasible and part of our nature, something that was endowed by us by our Creator, which gets reflected in the Declaration of Independence. But the way that we have had our freedoms of expression have not always existed. I mean, when we were colonies, back when the Founding Fathers were growing up, they grew up in an era where speaking out against your governor got you either the loss of an ear, whips to the face, or having your a hole bored into your tongue, which is interesting considering that is now a style that kids and adults like to have is the whole tongue piercing thing. But in 1791, the Bill of Rights was passed, and the First Amendment was ratified. And as you said, Avery, Congress shall make no law. But here's the kicker. When it was passed, it didn't have any type of impact on the states. So you couldn't say, well, it's my constitutional right in the state of Massachusetts, because the state of Massachusetts would be like, well, you're in the state of Massachusetts, therefore you have to follow our rules, not the federal government's rule. I mean, we grappled with this idea of freedom of speech all the way through 1798 in the second president of the United States, John Adams, who signed the Alien and Sedition Acts, and then turned around and used those acts to effectively put down any type of, or suppress any type of dissent, including from the opposition party, which got a lot of uproar from then Vice President Jefferson about it being unconstitutional.
It actually went farther back than even that. Back in 1765, you had the Stamp Act protests, and then of course we had the Boston Massacre in 1770. And of course, one thing that we know, which started out the revolution, was the Boston Tea Party.
Mm-hmm.
Those are all other examples of how we protested before we even became necessarily a nation.
Yeah, and I mean, I'll also add that the judicial system has been a bastion of those rights since the beginning. I mean, the Zenger trial of 1735, when we were still colonies, essentially said that even the ability to criticize your government should be protected, especially if you're using truth as a defense. So if you're being honest about it, there's nothing wrong with it. So essentially, the colonial jurists said that they didn't ascribe to the idea of malicious libel.
I mean, that's true. You already touched on the Seditious Act, but did you know there was another Sedition Act? It was in 1918, and that went along with the Espionage Act from 1917. So, I mean, we've been hitting on the right to protest and freedom of speech since way back when. and it just seems like it's going to continue, and no one seems to learn from the past. Like, we just keep going and going and going
Oh
round and
yeah,
round.
100%. I mean, you look at the Espionage and Sedition Act were established as part of the first Red Scare, right? And essentially, what happened is that during the 19th century to the early 20th century, we had the Civil War. We had a whole bunch of issues with habeas corpus getting suspended, with the First Amendment getting suspended, with President Lincoln arresting and then exiling editors who were opposed to what the union was doing. But the most important thing that came out of the 19th century and early 20th century was the case, or excuse me, were the case, the Schenck case in 1919, which established the clear and present danger test, what we know is the yelling fire in a theater test. And
Oh yeah.
then, and finally in 1925, in the Gitlow versus New York case, we finally saw incorporation occur. And incorporation is the doctrine in which the states have to adhere to the Constitution and the Bill of Rights as they're written. So, again, we have we fumble, we bumble, we kind of fall apart. But as we've progressed through history, we have consistently made leaps and bounds in the movement to gain or to preserve our rights, especially our right to protest and our right to dissent the government. Which kind
You know
of
what?
brings. Go ahead. Sorry.
No, I'm sorry. I was going to say what's kind of crazy is you mentioned that there was the first Red Scare, which, I mean, I didn't even realize until we were talking about this off the camera, that there was more than one Red Scare. There was the second one during McCarthyism, which also brought about the FBI, just freaking blacklisting people, making people do loyalty oaths. They were surveilling people, and they were harassing individuals and groups suspected of having communist ties or communist sympathies,
Sounds
which
familiar.
I was like, we could tie it back to what we got going on right now. So, but I mean, and like you said, you had the civil rights movement, which again, harassment and dealing with, hey, you can't do these things, when it was the First Amendment right to protest.
Yeah, what's really interesting is that you had you had the mid to late 20th century, which basically had the civil rights movement, right? You had the
Right.
NAACP versus Alabama and Edwards versus South Carolina. I mean, there were so many Supreme Court cases that dealt with freedom of speech, that dealt with the right to protest, that dealt with the right to assemble. It was during that period that essentially the courts came down and said, hey, listen, like, you can't tell someone that they can't protest on the streets because the streets are public property, and so they can do that. They reaffirmed like the proper time, place, and manner policies that were put out by the local states, right? But at the end of the day, they said, hey, if you're going to do this, you have to apply them broadly across the board. You can't have like, oh, well, we're not going to allow blacks to do this, which allowed for the Martin Luther King and the March on DC. And so, long story short, like, all of this comes around to like the courts continuously have made leaps and bounds to preserve our right and freedom to criticize our government. I mean, we had the Civil Rights Act, which was a great movement on the legislation side, but did you know that the Civil Rights Act included what was commonly known as the Riot Act,
Yes,
which
but
is
I don't
Title
remember
10
exactly. Yep.
Title 10 of the Civil Rights Act, and it was so overbroad, or it is so overbroad, that essentially it states that anyone who is actively engaged in a protest, if there is something else that happens, or if the protest turns violent, then you're all culpable, which is ridiculous, absolutely ridiculous. But it was put in there in order to tamp down on the protests of the 1960s, especially the civil rights protests and the Vietnam protests.
You're right, and during the civil rights movement, the federal government actually did play a role in protecting the civil rights, but then you also have to think about all these FBI files that are coming out where they're like, hey,
Hmm.
yeah, my bad, we did a bad thing. We should not have, had you guys under surveillance. And yeah, we're sorry.
Yeah, I
Like,
mean,
the hell?
it's one of those things. I mean, I think my two favorite cases that came out of the 60s, and it's just because of the irony here, right? Is that you had Tinker versus the state of Idaho, I believe it is. But
Sounds familiar.
essentially, there's a 13 and a 15-year-old kid wore black armbands to mourn the deaths of the Vietnam soldiers, and they were suspended for it. And they took that case all the way to the Supreme Court, and they were justified, and it was upheld by the Supreme Court that the states can't be like, hey, listen, your freedom of speech ends when you walk through the gates of a school. Like that's not how it works. And then Cohen versus California, where this guy literally walks into a court in LA wearing a jacket that said "fuck the draft." Right now,
Hmm.
imagine if someone walks into a court with a jacket that says "fuck ICE" in today's world. Right
I
back
mean,
then,
they are doing that,
right, but back then he was arrested for it,
right?
and he was arrested for disturbing the peace. And the Supreme Court came down and said, listen, like he isn't disturbing the peace. He's exercising his right. And so he's allowed to do that. And they overturned that conviction. And then, I mean, it's one of those things. And the most curious case was the Brandenburg case, right? Now, the Brandenburg case dealt with the Ku Klux Klan. And they dealt with talking about violence and uprisings and trying to overthrow the government. But they didn't really give specifics. They didn't really talk plans. And so essentially, what the court said is it's not against the law to talk about overthrowing the government. It's against the law to plan to overthrow the government. It's against the law to have dates and times and stuff like that. But if you're just talking about overthrowing the government, you're perfectly well within your rights. And of course, there was that Texas versus Johnson flag burning case where Texas tried to tell Johnson that he was breaking the law for burning the flag in public, which harkens back to today where the current administration just passed another or just issued another proclamation, executive order that says that burning the flag in public is now acceptable up to a year of jail time. Like, that's not how this works. What I'll say is that what struck out to me or stuck out to me during our historical research was the fact that pretty much everything in the First Amendment, all of the rights that we enjoy today and that we think, oh, this is cemented in the law, all of those things were given to us and defended by the Supreme Court, by the judicial process.
Needs to
And
be defended.
it given the light of the way that things are going and the way that the Supreme Court is acting, I mean, overturning 60 years of precedent in the Dobbs case and eliminating women's reproductive freedoms. And I'm sorry, correction, they didn't end reproductive freedom. They just sent it back to the states, which effectively ended reproductive freedom. It's just they consistently go through and override precedent after precedent after precedent after precedent, and it's I think Justice Jackson actually came out and said, it's like the Supreme Court. They're playing the the Calvin and Hobbes ball game. I forgot what it's called, where there are no rules and the rules change, and like no matter what you do, there's no really real winning because if you follow the rules, the opponent isn't going to follow the rules, and that's kind of what's going on right now. But we do have a long storied tradition of judicial review defending the American people's rights to dissent against the government. There are cases where you have justices saying, hey, we may not like it, but it's the right to say it, and so we have to allow it to be said, and that the market of truth or the market of speech is where truth will truly shine because it will outshine the false narratives. You have individuals that are going out and or excuse me, you have justices that are going out and talking to the issues of speech and how they impact others, and how we have the right to assemble, and we have the right to talk to one another about the way that things are going. And I think that one of the most fundamental things that I've read is that it is the duty of every American to have public discourse. And I think we talked to that in our opening line, but it is our duty. And that's the thing that we have to make more sense of. And folks, the reason that I put so much emphasis on history, aside from Avery telling me that I'm an educator and I do have a passion in teaching.
But it's okay. It's fantastic. I mean, important.
But here's the thing, right? I don't think that we would be in the situation that we are in today if we actually made an effort in our education system to teach the why behind what is going on historically, and to use historical lessons. We can't be afraid to teach this stuff. We can't be afraid to say that Thomas Jefferson was a really bad guy, but he had really good ideas. We can't be afraid of doing that.
It makes me think of Hamilton. I'm not gonna lie. Every time.
Jefferson was not the greatest dude. He really wasn't, but he had a lot of good ideas.
George
Even
Washington
Hamilton
wasn't
the greatest dude, but he had a lot of good ideas.
George Washington.
Yes.
Had great things. He did great things, but he also was not the greatest guy.
No, absolutely not.
Doesn't mean that they were terrible people because they did terrible things. Does that make part of them a bad guy? Yes, but the other part, they did good. That doesn't mean that it cancels out the bad, because it doesn't. But we wouldn't be here where we are if it wasn't for them as well. So it's like, it sucks to suck.
Yeah, history is littered with bad actors that do good things, right?
It's terrible.
And it's terrible, but that's the way that we advance. But we have to be willing to teach about these things. We have to be willing to learn about these things. And the reason that we have shifted the podcast to a more focused historical, and then modern day, which is next week for us, and then future, which is in the following week, but the reason we changed the structure is because we understand that the important thing is to ensure that the people have the information so that they are informed, which allows them to be engaged, which allows them to color outside the political lines that have been drawn for us by the powers that be that are currently in office. Comically, they drew more political lines in Texas, and they're doing it in California. And long story short.
But at least California is like, hey, can we do this? As opposed to, we are doing this. So
True. But I'm diametrically opposed to all gerrymandering.
Yeah.
But at the end of the day, what we covered today is just a small picture of the overall history of the freedom to protest as it applies to the First Amendment. And in keeping with our desire to make sure that the people are informed, Avery and I have put together a publication, Crayon Box Politics is putting together a publication that we're going to release this month that is going to be available for everyone to read through. It's a zinger. It's definitely not a page turner, but it's the history and it's the information that we talked about here, but also the information that is more in depth as we go through. So with that being said, as you listen to us talk here, please run to the website and download the PDF document that we're going to put up there for you to read. It's basically a companion publication. So you'll be able to see all of our sources, all of our research. We're showing you the work so that you can trust us.
And, I am all for learning everything, because if not, we're going to be continued to doomed to repeat it.
Frederick Douglass was quoted as saying that liberty is meaningless where the right to utter one's thoughts and opinions has ceased to exist. It is the right which they, the tyrants, first of all strike down. And over the past 8 months, what we have seen coming from the current administration feels as if those rights are being trampled.
Right. We have to remember that silence isn't neutral. When you stay on the sidelines, you hand power to those who want to erase these rights. Choosing not to act is still a choice, and it's one that helps them win.
Until next week, stay informed
Stay engaged.
and always color outside the lines.